Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. In this episode, I thought that I would make the rather injudicious decision to tackle a rather sensitive topic, namely slavery in Old Testament law, more particularly on Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 55. Now, I understand how much of a sensitive subject this actually can be, so I will certainly remain professional throughout the entirety of the video. And furthermore, I should also like to receive the same professionalism or courtesy should one counter my video as well, if in the probability it garners any attention at all. Moreover, this is the same reason why I have been so quiet on the topic, essentially because, well, it is an extremely controversial topic. And finally, I should like to argue, though, that the institution of slavery is evil. Can't believe I'm actually saying this, but here we are. God does not condone slavery, though, but he does allow it, much like God allows divorce, though he does not condone divorce either, by means of something called a redemptive covenant. So if you guys like this sort of content, do not hesitate to hit that like button, and make sure you guys are subscribed in order to receive future notifications on any upcoming videos, and let me know your thoughts and comments in the section below. If you would like to support the channel financially, I'll go ahead and list a link to my Patreon in the description below, and as always, let me know your thoughts and comments in the section below. So, with all this introductory stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into this week's topic. First up, Covenant of Redemption. So, I think it is beneficial to understand that the institution of slavery has existed since time immemorial. That is to say, the institution of slavery, as it is laid out in the Old Testament, is nothing new or fresh. The surrounding cultures partook in the institution, as well as the fledgling nation of Israel in the land of Canaan. However, I must admit that although this is an extremely emotional topic, I think it is best to look at it from the point of view of redemption, that is, through the lens of a redemptive covenant or theology. In his book, The Old Testament Law for the Life of the Church, Reading the Torah in Light of Christ, Dr. Richard Averbeck argues that each of the covenants operate redemptively. That is, each of the four major covenants, Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and finally the New Covenant, illustrate the progressive historical development of the covenants and their interrelationships. In other words, we see covenantal progression throughout its history. Each covenant builds on top of the other so that none of them eliminates the previous covenantal commitments. Each covenant functions under the umbrella of the previous covenant. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's nice, linguists, but what does this have to do with the institution of slavery we see in Leviticus 25? Excellent question, my friend. It is no surprise that the institution of slavery would fall under the Mosaic law, or covenant, when it comes to redemptive covenants. Before we delve into the exceptionally challenging topic, however, we should look at the entire chapter, since the institution of slavery must and should be taken into context here. So, this section of Leviticus is part of the greater Holiness Code, which consists of chapters 17 and, depending on your scholar, 26 or 27. What is the Holiness Code, though? Well, the Holiness Code is a discernible section within Leviticus that exhibits a distinctive theology, broadly described as a democratization of holiness ideals. According to Dr. John Hartley, the goal of the Holiness Code, and herein Leviticus 25 more specifically, is that these laws guard against the development of a class of perpetual Israelite slaves, rather than, or at least offering instead, a Hebrew freedom after 7 years of servitude. Furthermore, these laws are interrelated with the year of Jubilee at the beginning of chapter 25. Although the topic of Jubilee, whether it was an invention during the post-exilic period or it's older or more ancient, will be omitted, opting instead for debt and chattel slavery, at least the topic of the institution of debt and chattel slavery. But this is an extremely important topic to understand, that the Jubilee is the context through this chapter. What is interesting as well is that in the surrounding cultures like Babylon, the king would issue a decree releasing a slave, or he would release or relax a tax law. However, the release of enslaved peoples, whether debt or chattel enslaved peoples here in Old Testament law, or at least in Leviticus 25, as well as Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 15, were woven into the law, which was considered a radical change in the ancient Near East, who were unfortunately at the mercy of the monarch to release an enslaved person. Additionally, Dr. J. Sklar notes that these were sporadic, happening either when a king came to the throne or simply decided to proclaim a release. In fact, Dr. Walton adds that debt slaves were theoretically to be kept in bondage until the debt had been worked off. In practice, however, unless they were redeemed, they remained in the possession of the creditor as long as they lived. And the laws of Hammurabi redeemed this horrible scenario by limiting the service of a wife and her children to 3 years. Chattel slavery. Unfortunately, the Israelites were allowed to own or possess slaves from resident aliens in Israel and resident aliens born in Israel who may become perpetual enslaved peoples, as the text explicitly states in verses 44 through 46. I think that is something the Christian must and should come to terms with. However, I do have a stipulation here, and that is in light of redemptive theology, or redemptive covenant, which is the end goal was and still is the abolition of any sort of slavery. Sklar avers that the text addresses 2 natural questions that arise at this point for the Israelites. First, may they have permanent servants or slaves, enslaved peoples? Yes, but permanent servants or enslaved peoples must come from the nations surrounding Israel or foreign nationals living as temporary residents in their midst. Secondly, do these Israelites, or are these Israelites living as temporary residents, are they able to go free in the Jubilee? No. These servants may serve for life, although this law does not actually require that. Indeed, several A&E texts make clear that permanent enslaved peoples could gain their freedom. For example, in some texts, the servant or enslaved person was adopted by the master, usually in exchange for taking care of the master until death, at which point the slave would be free, according to Dr. Isaac Mendelsohn. Hartley notes that since slaves are classified achuza, or property or possession, they were regrettably passed from father to son as part of the family's inheritance. Nevertheless, the law requires that an Israelite treat his slaves kindly. Given this permission to possess or own enslaved peoples, it is reiterated that a master may not rule over an Israelite slave or enslaved person ruthlessly, as laid out in Exodus 21. Whereas this legislation frees the citizen of Israel from any fear of indigenous slavery, it also shows that the path to travel before the institution of slavery is universally condemned will be very long. Dr. Richard Hess argues that 2 qualifications exist when it comes to verses 44 through 46. Hess states, as noted in Leviticus 19, verses 26 through 28, the prohibition against placing marks on the body contradicts the requirement that all permanent slaves be so marked and renders slaveholding impossible for Israelites. Full obedience of the Levitical law will pull away from the practice of keeping enslaved peoples. Secondly, Christians must understand that the picture in the New Testament is one in which the barriers between the nations have been broken down. See Ephesians 2, verses 11 through 22. And the traditional distinctions of status have been initiated in the Old Testament and achieved their full flowering in the New Testament with the abolition of those same distinctions that Leviticus 25 mandated as necessary. On this same topic, Averbeck notes that there was chattel slavery in the Bible as well. There were some protections, though, even for them. The master must be careful not to abuse his slaves. For example, or enslaved peoples. For example, Exodus 21 verses 20 through 21 states, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, or the enslaved person dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the enslaved person survives a day or 2, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And Exodus 26 and 27 states, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of a slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. These laws seek the protection of enslaved peoples, whether debt or chattel enslaved peoples. from injuries caused by abuse from the master, leading to their release under such circumstances. Another example is in Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, though I will leave out the verse itself. In fact, if an enslaved person took refuge in another community because he or she had been mistreated, they must allow such an enslaved person to live among them wherever he choose, according to Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16. There was plenty of room for abuse, of course, but the judicial regulations show real concerns for the humanity of both debt and chattel enslaved peoples. In general, debt slavery honored the link that remained between the enslaved person and their natal family. In chattel slavery, however, the slave or enslaved person belonged to the master and his household, whether that be a family household or the extended temple or palace household. Indebted enslaved peoples return. In verses 47 through 55, the writer spells out the regulations for an Israelite who has become poor to seek out to sell himself to a resident alien or temporary resident alien or even a member of a resident alien's family. Again, the standard to treat the enslaved person, whether Israelite or alien, with kindness is paramount. As Hartley again concludes, saying that the standard by which an Israelite master is to govern an Israelite servant is the standard also for a resident alien handling of an Israelite servant. A foreign master is to treat his Israelite servant as a hired hand. He may not treat him harshly. The goal here was to maintain the freedom of the poor because debt was the primary source of enslaved peoples in the ancient Near East. Fortunately, if an Israelite does not sell himself into slavery, he does not lose the possibility of redemption, that is, one of his kinsmen may redeem him. All those who are able to redeem the poor Israelite include the brother, uncle, cousin, and finally the nearest kinsman in his extended family. In the final two verses here, if the poor Israelite is not redeemed, he will gain his freedom in the year of Jubilee, with each Israelite slave or enslaved person taking his children with him into freedom. Dr. J. Sklar opines that the purpose of Leviticus 25 is to ensure that the Israelites were in close relationships with their families, had ownership of land, and finally observed the Sabbath principle. These three principles were threatened by debt, unfortunately, which would or could force the Israelites off their land. Fortunately, though, the laws of redemption and Jubilee provided clearance or cancellation of debt, enabling those who did sell themselves into slavery to return to their clans, and that included the property as well. Averbeck builds on Sklar here by stating that it is worthwhile reflection that the first set of civil laws in the earliest collection, namely the Book of the Covenant, describes the treatment of Israelite enslaved peoples in Exodus 21, verses 1 through 11. He goes on to say that rabbinic thought wisely suggested that this was because God wished to define most closely those laws respecting those most vulnerable in society. Thus, the commitment to love one's neighbor extended first to those most likely to be forgotten, namely the enslaved peoples. The same is true of this chapter here in Leviticus. God is not only concerned with the land and how the sabbatical and jubilee years provide rest for it, but also expresses concern for those on the lowest rung of the ladder of society, and how the message of God's love for all his people includes the most vulnerable. A good example is to whom Christ ministered to those who were physically needy and spiritually impoverished. Conclusion. In conclusion, though the covenant of redemption, God allowed the institution of slavery. That is to say, each of the covenants operate redemptively, that is, each of the covenants, Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and finally New Covenant, illustrate the progressive historical development of the covenants and their inner relationships. Unfortunately, Leviticus 25 verses 44 through 46 does permit chattel slavery that could become generational, which again is something that Christians must understand and come to terms with. However, like indebted enslaved peoples, chattel enslaved peoples were afforded all of the protections and rights that indebted enslaved peoples also had. Finally, indebted enslaved peoples are those who sought to sell themselves out to a resident alien or temporary resident and a member of a resident alien's family. Kindness was paramount here, just as it was with chattel enslaved peoples. Now, before leaving, I want to end this video with the words of Dr. Sklar, whom I think perfectly sums up this difficult chapter. I think it is important to remember that the Israelite masters did not have absolute control over their enslaved peoples. Enslaved peoples had legal protections that were recognized and safeguarded their humanity. Furthermore, these types of slavery, if performed under the humane conditions required by law, could be said to be little different experientially from many kinds of paid employment in a cash economy. In both cases, one person submits to the control of another and provides labor in exchange for certain benefits, whether that's money, food, or shelter. Indeed, the potential benefits were great enough that some people sought to become permanent enslaved peoples. These benefits included protection from poverty, provision of regular food and shelter, and a place in a stable family. For those in poverty or facing it, this type of servitude was literally a lifesaver. The text does make clear that permanent servitude was not to be applied to Israelites unless they so choose. The reason is theological. They are servants of the Lord who had delivered them from Egyptian slavery into his permanent service. This rationale does not apply to non-Israelites who have not experienced such redemption and are not naturally covenant members. But even here, the same legal safeguards applied, and several laws presume that enslaved peoples, even those from foreign lands, would be treated as household members, and thus able to partake in Israelite celebrations like the Passover and the feasting of Israelite festivals. This was indeed the very opposite of dehumanization. So, if you guys like this video, I encourage you guys to hit that like button and subscribe. If you would like to support me on Patreon, again, the link will be in the description below. And as always, let me know your thoughts and comments in the section below. And I'll see you guys next time.